They called it the Soviet century, the world's largest country, a nuclear arsenal that could end civilization twice over, free healthcare, guaranteed housing, a space program that put the first man in orbit. And then, in December 1991, it simply ceased to exist. No invasion, no plague, no asteroid. The Soviet Union collapsed because the price of oil dropped. How does a superpower dissolve over the cost of gasoline? The story begins not with weakness, but with wealth. In 1973, Arab nations cut oil production to punish the West for supporting Israel. Prices quadrupled overnight. The Soviet Union, sitting on massive oil reserves in Siberia, suddenly found itself holding the planet's most valuable commodity. Every barrel pumped from the frozen ground translated to hard currency. Dollars, Deutschmarks, francs. Real money that could buy Western grain, technology, and machinery that Soviet factories couldn't produce. By the late 1970s, oil exports accounted for over 60% of Soviet hard currency earnings. The Kremlin used this cash to paper over the cracks in a fundamentally broken economic system. Central planners in Moscow still decided how many shoes to produce, how much bread to bake, what crops to plant. These decisions, made by committee and five-year plan, were consistently wrong. Soviet factories produced steel nobody needed and ignored products people wanted. But as long as oil money flowed, the government could import grain from America, subsidize food prices, and maintain the illusion of socialist prosperity. The leadership knew the system was fragile. Soviet economists quietly warned that betting everything on a single commodity was dangerous. A 1977 internal memo, classified for years, explicitly stated that oil dependency would eventually threaten the economic sovereignty of the state. The recommendation was clear: diversify the economy, improve manufacturing efficiency, allow limited market reforms. The memo was filed and forgotten. Why fix what appeared to be working? Oil prices kept climbing. By 1980, crude hit $35 per barrel. The money machine was printing too fast to question. Then came Afghanistan. In December 1979, Soviet troops rolled into Kabul to prop up a communist government. The plan was simple: stabilize the regime, withdraw in a few months. Instead, they stepped into a decade-long nightmare. Mujahideen fighters, funded by American and Saudi money, turned the country into a graveyard for Soviet ambitions. The war devoured resources. Every helicopter shot down, every convoy ambushed, every soldier killed, added to a bill the Kremlin paid in rubles. It was printing faster than ever. By the mid-1980s, Afghanistan was costing the Soviet Union an estimated $5 billion annually. The oil money that once covered economic inefficiency now had to cover a war as well. And then the floor dropped out. In 1986, Saudi Arabia made a strategic decision. For years, they had cut production to keep prices high. But holding back oil meant losing market share to other producers, so they opened the taps. Supply flooded the market. Within months, oil prices collapsed from $30 per barrel to under $10, a 70% drop. For the Soviet Union, this wasn't just a bad quarter. It was an economic heart attack. Imagine you're living on credit cards, making minimum payments only because your salary keeps increasing. Then overnight, your income gets cut by 2/3. That's what happened to the Soviet state. The hard currency dried up, import purchases ground to a halt, grain shipments from the West slowed, store shelves emptied, food rationing returned to major cities for the first time since World War II. This is where Mikhail Gorbachev enters the story, a reformer handed a ticking bomb with the timer already running. He understood the system was dying. His response was glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. Allow criticism, permit limited private enterprise, expose the corruption rotting the bureaucracy from within. The theory was sound. Shine light on the problems, empower citizens to demand change, modernize without abandoning socialism. In practice, glasnost without structural support was like removing a dam without draining the reservoir first. Decades of suppressed anger came flooding out. Ethnic tensions, regional grievances, nationalist movements, all the contradictions held together by authoritarian force suddenly had permission to speak. And they were furious. The Baltic states demanded independence. Ukraine questioned Moscow's authority. The Caucasus erupted in ethnic violence. What began as controlled reform became uncontrolled disintegration. Meanwhile, the economy continued its death spiral. Without oil revenue, the government couldn't afford subsidies. Factories shut down. Unemployment spiked in a country where employment was constitutionally guaranteed. The ruble, already weak, became nearly worthless on international markets. People hoarded goods. Bartering replaced buying. A carton of cigarettes became more valuable than a month's wages. Here's the fatal mistake. The decision that sealed the collapse. Gorbachev and his advisors believed they could reform the economy slowly while maintaining political control. They thought you could introduce market mechanisms without market consequences, allow free speech without losing authority, admit past failures without people questioning present legitimacy. They were trying to land a plane while rebuilding the engines mid-flight. It couldn't work. It was never going to work. By 1989, the Soviet Union was technically bankrupt. Foreign debt had exploded from $20 billion in 1985 to over $70 billion. Credit lines dried up. Western banks stopped lending. The government couldn't pay its own employees on time. Soldiers went without wages. Pensioners received coupons instead of cash. The nuclear superpower was functionally broke, and then the dominoes fell. East Germany opened the Berlin Wall in November 1989. Poland elected a non-communist government. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution swept away the party without firing a shot. The Soviet satellite states, watching Moscow's economic implosion, decided to save themselves. The empire didn't fight to hold them. There was no money to fight, no political will, no faith in the system worth defending. Inside the Soviet Union itself, republics started declaring sovereignty. Not independence yet, just the assertion that local laws superseded Moscow's. Estonia moved first in 1988, others followed. By 1990, even the Russian Republic, the core of the Soviet state, declared its laws supreme. The federal government in Moscow became a hollowed-out shell, issuing decrees nobody followed, governing a country that no longer recognized its authority. The final act came in August 1991. Hardliners attempted a coup, desperate to restore the old order. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest and rolled tanks into Moscow. The coup failed within 3 days, not because of military defeat, but because nobody cared. The soldiers wouldn't shoot civilians. The people didn't fear the party anymore. The economic collapse had vaporized the government's legitimacy. You can't rule through fear when you can't even keep the lights on. By December, it was over. Ukraine voted for independence. Belarus followed. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all the republics chose sovereignty over the sinking Soviet ship. On December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev resigned. The red hammer and sickle flag came down from the Kremlin. The Soviet Union, 74 years after its founding, ceased to exist. The death certificate could have listed a single cause: commodity dependency in a volatile market. The human cost was staggering. Savings vanished overnight as the ruble became worthless. Pensions that once guaranteed modest security couldn't buy bread. Life expectancy in Russia dropped by 6 years during the 1990s, a peacetime decline unprecedented in the developed world. Crime exploded. Public health collapsed. Whole industries disappeared. For millions of people, the end of the Soviet Union meant the end of the only stability they'd ever known. But the geopolitical cost might have been even greater. The Soviet collapse left a power vacuum across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Ethnic conflicts erupted in the Caucasus. Yugoslavia tore itself apart in genocidal wars. Nuclear weapons sat in newly independent countries with uncertain command structures. The unipolar moment, America as sole superpower, reshaped global politics in ways we're still grappling with today. And here's what should worry us. The pattern isn't unique. Right now, multiple countries run economies dangerously dependent on single commodities. Oil states in the Middle East, resource extractors in Africa and Latin America. When prices are high, governments spend like there's no tomorrow. They build cities, fund militaries, subsidize everything. The money masks inefficiency, corruption, and structural weakness. And when prices crash, because they always crash, the whole system comes apart. We saw this in Venezuela, turning from South America as richest nation to a humanitarian catastrophe when oil prices dropped in 2014. We see it in Russia today, still dependent on hydrocarbon exports, still vulnerable to the same shocks that killed the Soviet Union. The lesson is clear. Prosperity built on a single commodity isn't prosperity. It's a loan with terrible terms, and eventually the bill comes due. The Soviet Union's collapse teaches us that economic systems built on unsustainable foundations will fail, no matter how powerful they appear. Military strength doesn't matter if you can't pay the soldiers. Nuclear weapons don't matter if you can't feed the scientists who maintain them. Ideology doesn't matter if the grocery stores are empty. The oil glut of the 1980s didn't just change the price at the pump. It redrew the map of the world, ended the Cold War, and proved that in the long run, economics defeats everything else. The Soviet leaders who ignored diversification warnings in the 1970s thought they were being pragmatic. They were actually writing the empire's obituary. The price of oil fell. A superpower followed. And somewhere, in some capital city right now, leaders are making the exact same mistake, convinced their boom will never go bust. History suggests otherwise. It always does.